Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie back with Democracy Tomorrow. Today we're going to talk about the future of Australia's human rights policy with the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Human Rights Law Centre, Caitlin Reiger, who is going to share her experiences from working all around the world on human rights issues and now her current issues that she's working on within Australia to improve the human rights environment in this country. So Caitlin, welcome to Democracy Tomorrow.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
So before we start talking about the details of Australian human rights law and policy, maybe just tell us a bit about your own background in the human rights field, various countries around the world.
Yeah, I guess I've been working as a human rights lawyer for around 25 years. Started off in domestic practice here in Australia, but then mainly spent a lot of time working closely with communities as well as with governments and institutions in a number of different countries, particularly coming out of conflict or coming out of authoritarian regimes where there was, a real push to work out how to bring justice to situations of mass atrocity, situations that go well beyond what the ordinary legal system is designed usually to cope with, and all of the complexity and messiness of doing that in a way that that brings a sense of justice to people and puts societies on a stronger human rights respecting footing for the future.
What were some of the countries where you worked?
I've helped set up an NGO in Timor-Leste that still continues now to do independent monitoring of the court system. It started off looking at the atrocity trials that were being run after the referendum, the independence vote from Indonesia. Worked at the War Crimes Tribunal in Sierra Leone, but also with the processes in Cambodia and Bosnia. Spent many years then in Myanmar as well, working on sort of justice sector reform and support for local civil society organisations that were trying to bring legal and rights awareness. And I think that's actually where we met, Scott, in Myanmar.
Indeed it is. One of the many countries in which we both worked actually over the years. And I'm sure you share the same level of, well, for lack of a better word, frustration at what it actually takes to infuse the spirit of human rights into countries which are emerging from both, dictatorial and authoritarian regimes and, military occupation and all sorts of other problems, and just how hard that really is, and I think that's one of the telltale stories of all of the work I have done around the world on human rights issues. There's just that frustration level that they have, everything is on the table for the taking, and yet whatever influences are at play politically, economically, socially from other countries, it just doesn't happen. And then it just slides back into its own realm. And, maybe one day, given current political circumstances in a certain country on the other side of a certain ocean, we might meet again in a post-conflict peace operation. You never know. So tell us a little bit about the work of the Australian Human Rights Law Centre, which is based in Melbourne. What are the main issues you guys are working on these days?
Yeah, so the Human Rights Law Centre, we are a sort of a specialised community legal centre. So we do strategic litigation as well as a broad range of public policy and advocacy work. Our particular focus right now is really trying to zero in on where we see some of the biggest human rights challenges in Australia, and looking at that particularly in the context of Australia's history, but also Australia's present in terms of barriers to racial and socioeconomic equality. And so that really ranges from work on First Nations justice issues, particularly around trying to tackle the ongoing just abomination that is ongoing deaths in custody of Aboriginal people. That has been a persistent issue for, since there was a formal inquiry over 30 years ago, and there's still so many of those recommendations that haven't come to pass. We know that First Nations people are incarcerated at levels completely disproportionate to the amount of the population that they are, particularly children. It's shocking to many people it's completely unacceptable that in almost all Australian jurisdictions, you can be an 11-year-old and be charged as an adult with a criminal charge. And so, we have a crisis of youth justice around the country, in particular jurisdictions at the moment, but that is just completely beyond the pale. We've also done for a long time work around the other big obvious area of human rights crisis in Australia, which is really the treatment of asylum seekers and those seeking safety here. This has again been a long-standing feature of Australia's pretty cruel and brutal immigration policy, and so we've worked for a long time to draw attention to the problems around the mandatory detention of asylum seekers and the use of immigration detention, but also more broadly now looking at the precariousness that it puts many people into when they don't have any path to permanent visa status in the country. And so looking at that really from a broader perspective of migration justice, and the vulnerabilities that it puts people in a workplace where they can't speak up against workplace abuse because their visa might be withdrawn. And so there's been really significant progress on some of those things, but at the bigger level, our immigration system is still completely not in accordance with basic human rights standards. We also are really looking at the kind of lack of clear foundations in Australian law for human rights protections. So we've been long looking at what that means in individual state and territory jurisdictions, but also what it means at the federal level and how to really bring to life Australia's international human rights obligations. We've signed up to all of the major international human rights treaties for a long time now, but you can't use those in domestic courts. So largely, we have a range of areas that we work on there. Most prominently at the moment, what it means for people who are trying to exercise their basic democratic rights, around protest, around speaking up when they see wrongdoing. So we're supporting. We've launched Australia's first whistleblowing legal service to provide advice and support to people who are seeking to call out wrongdoing that they see in whether it's in government departments or in a range of workplace settings as well. And then we also look at the activities of Australian businesses. And so we've been doing quite a bit of work around the attempt to bring into Australian law protections against modern slavery. And we're involved in working closely with a community in Bougainville that's holding the mining giant Rio Tinto to account for failing to clean up the devastation caused by its former mine in Panguna, which has had devastating effects for the community. So they're just a number of the things that we're working on. But yeah, there's sadly no shortage of things to do.
Well, your hands are full. So I think it will surprise a lot of people that know about Australia and know that the standard of living is very high and the level of democracy is very high. And generally speaking, by comparison, the human rights protections are pretty good. You won't be randomly plucked off the street too frequently, etc. But talk a bit more, perhaps, about the disconnect between the fact that Australia has very disproportionately, in a positive manner, influenced international human rights law and international human rights policy for a century or more. The drafters of the UN Charter, Doc Everett was Australian. His daughter became a leading figure internationally, Elizabeth Everett. Philip Alston is one of the great international lawyers of all time. He's Australian. The recently deceased James Crawford was Australian. Hilary Charlesworth is now on the International Court of Justice, and the list goes on and on and on. I could go on for a long time. We're only 1/3 of 1% of the world population. So there has been this massive impact by Australians from an Australian worldview onto the body of international human rights law and the procedures and mechanisms and everything else. There's 2 special rapporteurs right now, human rights rapporteurs at least, maybe more, who are Australian. So why is it so difficult to convert these international norms that Australians have had such a positive impact on into the domestic legal order, and in particular, not just the lawmaking, but the application of them by the courts? Because countries at our similar level of economic wealth and development, fellow OECD members, most of them, not all, but most of them would have a much more positive and embracing spirit towards applying human rights laws domestically than Australia does. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. So why is that, and what are the obstacles to doing that, and what can be done to make the situation better?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Scott, that Australia seems to produce completely disproportionate numbers of really high quality international lawyers, and who have had huge impact across the whole evolution of the modern system of human rights protection and the modern sort of international legal frameworks. But there is a disconnect between what that looks like outside and what it looks like then in terms of our domestic legal framework. And there's a number of reasons for that. But part of it goes back to the legal framing that is behind modern Australia as a country. It goes right back to the way in which colonization began in Australia. We were founded on a legal fiction that this was uninhabited land. So right from the very beginning, there was a disconnect and a denial of a recognition of the first, inhabitants of Australia as people who had land and customs and laws and that were blatantly broken and violated through the whole system of dispossession and colonization in the country, to the point of being rendered invisible at a legal level. It was only in 1992 that the High Court, the highest court in Australia, overturned that legal fiction and recognised that there were ongoing rights to land in what's now kind of recognised as native title. So you're starting there, and then when you look at then modern Australia's legal framework, our constitution was developed in the late 1890s, and we are a federation, and a federation that had pre-existing but pretty nascent young colonial states that came together to be a federation. And they looked at the big democracies of the world, and they looked at the big features of those constitutions. They looked at France, they looked particularly at the US, and there were live debates at that point about whether to include basic rights protections as they were described in the 1890s, to put that into our founding constitution. And it was rejected. So things like equality before the law was not part of Australia's constitution, or other sort of basic rights being elaborated. And there were reasons for that are very pertinent to remember today as part of that historical and political context. And they were racist reasons. So the individual states did not want to have any restriction on their ability to make laws for the control of their Aboriginal populations, or also for Chinese immigration in particular. The gold rush had already happened in Australia. You already had, the beginnings of multicultural Australia and long-standing immigration coming in from Afghans, from China, from all sorts of places. And that was also seen as a threat to the sense of what that colonial entity that was becoming Australia was. The very first piece of legislation that was introduced by the federal parliament, after Australia was created in 1901, was the White Australia Policy, a piece of legislation that prioritised immigration access to people from Northern European countries. So we grapple still with the legacy of that today, but it's baked into the framework. And so we don't have a Bill of Rights in our constitution, which still shocks many people. There's surveys done every year, particularly by Amnesty International, and many people think we do have that. And in some ways, it's great that they think we do, because there is an assumption that these are shared values and that they should be codified, and you should be able to rely on them and use them as tools, just like you use legal tools to assert your rights in many other ways. But we don't have any central place where that's written down. It's not taught then as part of our civics education, and we don't use the language of rights at a day-to-day level in Australia. So we have this contradiction. We have Australia then signing up and being a leading role in helping create the post-war system of protection for human rights. But we also then have a level of complacency, and I would say maybe arrogance to some degree as well, that our system is great and it's fine and we don't need that here at home. But of course, what that hides is who is left behind and who is falling through the gaps in our system of protections. And so we have a very messy patchwork of rights protections in Australia that doesn't necessarily match up with the sort of the coherent language that has evolved at the international level, which of course is based on trying to look at all of the complexity of what different countries do and trying to distill that into some shared common values. But that looks kind of different here. And I think the other key historical piece that I think is really important to understand why is that in the the international system really struggled to come or to be effective in the first decades of the UN's existence. It was crippled by the Cold War, and the international mechanisms that were being built were still very hard to really make use of until the 1990s. And then you saw this explosion of activity and recourse to these international mechanisms. Of course, appropriately, Australian civil society started using that as well, and you started having international human rights mechanisms appropriately and rightly shine the spotlight onto established democracies like Australia as well, and started being critical and started highlighting the treatment of asylum seekers in particular, and particularly the treatment of First Nations people in Australia. And there was a political response at that time, which also happened to coincide with the war on terror and the response to 9/11 then as you moved into the early 2000s, a domestic response of, well, we don't want to be told what to do by these international bodies. And so just at the time when there would have been, I think, a moment for embedding more of these things into our domestic process and domestic systems, you had a political kind of wave of resistance to that. And so we're still dealing with the legacy of all of those things.
I mean, there was a movement here in the late 80s, early 90s to adopt a Bill of Rights. I think they used that language at the time. So what were some of the arguments by those who opposed that? Like, what were the public arguments made by conservative forces in the country that said, we don't need a Bill of Rights, we're Australia?
Yeah, it's really interesting in trying to understand where that level of resistance comes to, given the level of broad popular support for the concepts and the values behind it. Value, equality and fairness and dignity and all things that in many ways are seen to be quintessentially part of the Australian kind of right to a fair go. And I think part of it is, there's a number of things. There was, I think, a concern that the US kind of model of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution handed over power to an unelected judiciary. That's one of the arguments that's been made, that Australia, one of the features of Australia's particular democratic traditions in the way it's evolved slightly differently from the UK or from other places, is this privileging of parliamentary sovereignty. And the idea that, our elected officials, we entrust them to make the decisions of what the population needs, and the democratic process is itself the accountability mechanism. Now, but we all know that, of course, democracies can turn into tyranny of the majority as well. And so, but that fear of handing things over to an unelected judiciary, and in Australia, because we don't have very clear prescribed rights in the Constitution, what we do have is implied rights that have come out through case law of taking cases to the High Court. And the High Court has read into the language that's in the Constitution, some forms of human rights protection, but they don't necessarily match up fully with the international definitions. And freedom of expression is one of them. We have an implied right to political communication, but that's not the full scope of really what we understand, freedom of expression to be under international law.
Right. Well, so the obstacles are quite big, but if Parliament approved a federal Human Rights Act, then people who were once opposed to the Bill of Rights wouldn't have that much opposition to an unelected judiciary making decisions on that basis.
Well, exactly, and there's been a number of attempts to really progress the discussion around a legislated Human Rights Act, which is what New Zealand has. It's what the UK now has. There's a number of jurisdictions that have taken this approach. And it's actually the approach that's been taken in several of the Australian subnational jurisdictions as well. So we actually do have a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities in Victoria, where Melbourne is. We have a Human Rights Act in Queensland. We have a Human Rights Act in the Australian Capital Territory. So that we have 3 jurisdictions where there are basic human rights protections. They don't fully match up with the full range of the international protected rights that Australia has accepted in terms of its international obligations. But it is a good start. But it also means that it depends where you live in this country. You know, your postcode depends whether or not you actually have the ability to rely on those rights. And so that's a you know, a gap and an added piece of complexity. But I think the other, you know, there's been a really important new development just in the last 12 months. There was an effort around consultation, a big public consultation about a decade ago, to look at the need for a Human Rights Act. And that was a really extensive process. One of the concerns at that point as well was that, you know, this is one of the other critiques, is that it would turn into a lawyer's picnic. There would be, you know, all this litigation. Now, there's litigation every time there's a new important piece of legislation, and that's not seen as a problem. That's just seen as testing the bounds of it. But, you know, it's another way of looking at this. You know, we don't want to hand things to the courts. So the model that has been used in the state level jurisdictions is what's called the dialogue model. So, you know, the courts can make an interpretation of what the rights that are protected are. It doesn't invalidate the law, but it sends a message to go back to Parliament that you might need to go back and think about this to make it actually compliant. And it's seen as then having a dialogue between the branches of government. That model is now what's being proposed for a Federal Human Rights Act as well. And just last year, we had a really significant step forward when there was a major inquiry undertaken by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. This is a standing committee of the Federal Parliament that was created after that effort a decade ago. We didn't get a Human Rights Act up at the time, but what we did get was at least some mechanism in the Parliament to scrutinise the impact of new legislation in relation to Australia's human rights obligations. That committee last year ran a significant inquiry to revise and look at Australia's human rights framework, and it came out after listening to hundreds and hundreds of submissions from around the country that were overwhelmingly in favour of the Human Rights Act this time. So the opposition that we saw a decade ago has significantly reduced, and their first recommendation was legislate a Human Rights Act. And here's a sample one we've put together for you to kick the conversation off. And that proposed model basically takes the main human rights elements from the 2 most significant human rights treaties, from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So it includes things like the right to a fair trial, the right to freedom of expression, the right to be free from torture, as well as some really foundational economic and social rights around that right to health and education and housing. And we know that those things are also what speaks to people in Australia, that people are concerned about a cost of living crisis, about a housing crisis, and access to decent healthcare. We have, a pretty remarkable healthcare system in Australia, but that doesn't mean that it is equally accessible to everybody. And so that's what's now been proposed. We have something really concrete to focus on, and we are very much hoping that this new government, now that it's been elected with a significant majority, is in the best possible position to now move forward and introduce a draft bill for proper discussion, and we might actually get the basic level of human rights protections in a really clear, simple way that would give people a tool to seek justice when they need, and would give governments and all decision makers a clear set of guidelines that just shows that they have to think about the impact on people when they're making public decisions.
Right. I saw recently, just a couple of days ago, that there's a move to insert the right to adequate housing into the Victorian Charter on human rights. I think it's led by the Green Party. I'm not sure, but it's not currently there now. But so it's a very much of a living, breathing process, and particularly in a country where housing costs are so high and where it's so difficult for younger people in particular to enter the housing market. Every time I teach a law school course, one of the first things I ask the students, they're 22, 24 years old, raise your hand if you think you're going to be able to afford a house by the time you're 40. And no one ever raises their hand anymore. So, I mean, that's quite a shocking indictment that the system here is so predicated to favor those who are already, the propertied classes, that something needs to give, at some point in time. Did the Albanese government put anything in their political party manifesto for the most recent election on the Bill of Rights idea or the federal Human Rights Act?
So the commitment to a federal human rights act has been part of the National Labor Party platform for some time now. It wasn't made an explicit electoral promise, and I think there were concerns that nobody wanted to be taking attention during an election campaign on something that could be seen as feeding into the culture wars. Now, I don't think a Human Rights Act should be seen as a cultural football if it's really about just putting in place. It's a codification of shared values. I don't think you find many people who would disagree with the idea, around everybody having, the right to be treated with basic dignity. It's minimum standards is all human rights protections are. We have aspirational elements in terms of social levels of social and economic rights, but that also, that's been worked out as well. That was one of the concerns originally around a Human Rights Act too. That it's very hard to legislate around a standard of living. Now, we know they are old debates. It's perfectly possible for courts to take sensible decisions around allocation of resources on public policy matters. They do that all the time, and so those areas of opposition I think have fallen away as well. But we have really significant, I think, new opportunities as well to make a human rights codification in this country also not just address some of those minimum things, but also recognize where we're heading into the future. So the right to a healthy environment is one of the newer areas of international law. It's not actually codified yet in one of the human rights conventions. The Australian Capital Territory has just decided to add that into their Charter of Human Rights, into their human rights legislation. And so the recommendation from the Parliamentary Joint Committee for a Federal Human Rights Act has also recommended that would be one example of a chance where we could actually step up and help lead the way in the development of international law again, which is really exciting. I mean, the Victorian Charter of Human Rights is it's 20 years old. It came into force in 2006. It doesn't have housing or health or education. It has the right to culture in there, and in the Australian Capital Territory there is the right to education protected. So these things are all kind of building off each other as well. But we also have really practical examples of how domestic human rights legislation has been used to give meaning to those rights to housing. So we have examples from Queensland where you have somebody being evicted from their house, somebody who's been experiencing domestic violence and property damage caused by their former partner means somebody was about to lose their tenancy, but they were able to make arguments on human rights grounds that would have removed that person's that person's right to housing effectively. So there's ways in which these are just tools. These are legal tools to bring some basic dignity into people's lives.
And I think one of the great virtues of human rights law that not everybody realizes is that it's really a negotiated series of shared values at the end of the day, right? So it's not extreme right wing in any way where it's just pure power that controls everything, and it's not extreme left wing where the state takes all of the rights away and it allocates them as it sees fit. It's the middle way, and small countries, medium-sized countries like Australia, generally also at a foreign policy level pursue the middle way. They don't go too far usually one way or too far the other. Of course, there's all sorts of countries which are non-aligned. There's all sorts of countries that are neutral. Clearly, Australia now is in the Western camp, and it's always been in the Western camp. But I think another one of those things which needs to be looked at with respect to Australia's human rights policy domestically and internationally, is where Australia ends up placing itself vis-a-vis other countries and the shared values that they have and the belief and sanctity of the international rule of law and stuff. So you would have all sorts of things that Australia has already embraced, such as membership in the International Criminal Court, compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, taking the lead now, actually, at the international level on a new UN Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders. All sorts of things which are completely contrary to the policy of its number one ally right now, the United States. And at some point in time, a decision will need to be made, and this is discussed a lot in the Australian media these days. Where should Australia go, politically speaking? Viewers might not realize that whereas the U.S. and the Western group of nations is clearly, the camp in which Australia finds itself now, there is a growing sentiment within Australia. There was just a poll taken today, in fact, that said that 54% of the population was against this new military alliance called AUKUS, which is a terrible acronym, first and foremost. But, and it's an alliance between the U.S. and the U.K. and Australia, and there's growing opposition to that, and it's very public. And that has huge, human rights and foreign policy implications as well. At the same time, it might not be realized by everybody watching this, but China is by far the biggest trading partner, which has a different political system, which has a different way of running things, and yet the relationship is very solid and very, very clear. So it's not possible for Australia to put all of its cards into either one of those camps, right? So the logical point of view, from my perspective at least, and I think a growing number of people, is that now is the time, particularly with the labor majority being so huge, and probably unprecedentedly huge, it will probably never be this huge again, to forge a third way and in effect become, the equivalent of what Sweden was in the 1970s, leading, the vanguard group of states that said human rights matter the most. International development assistance and assistance to the developing world matters the most. And I think so many ingredients of that are already in place today. We may have horrible things like offshore detention of so-called failed asylum seekers, and we have horrible problems in the indigenous sphere. The recent referendum failed called the Voice referendum, which had very low kind of outcomes if it passed in terms of structural changes to things, and yet it still didn't pass. But at the same time, we take in 200 to 400,000 immigrants a year with barely a peep by anybody anywhere on the political spectrum, sometimes, but quite minor. So I'm just wondering, you as a lifelong Australian, me as a new Australian, do you see any prospect for something like that emerging where like Australia really decides once and for all, because they're starting to do it in the Pacific, like really, I've worked a lot in the Pacific. I've noticed a fundamental change in the last 5 years compared to the Liberal Party conservative coalition, which was in place long before that. Most of the Pacific just looked askance at Australia then. They were climate change deniers. They were belittling the poor little islanders and things like that. And now there's a real sense of, equality. We're all in this together. We want to do what we can on the climate change front. It's not perfect, but it's better. And, also developing bilateral agreements between countries like Tuvalu and Australia, where Australia has essentially agreed to take in a number of Tuvaluans each year as a way of dealing with, growing habitability of the islands because of climate change. So there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle, I think, in place. And I think it's also consistent with what a lot of Australians would actually like. I mean, most Australians, like most people, most places, don't really care that much about foreign policy at the end of the day. They want to pay their bills and have a peaceful life. But I think those who do think about it see that this little tiny corner, the lower right-hand corner of the world map, as I always say, has a lot to offer in terms of showing what's possible. And, we've talked a lot about our electoral system here on this channel and other attributes. So do you have any thoughts on that before we wrap up today?
Yeah, look, I think this kind of goes to one of these unresolved aspects of Australia's national identity about where it fits in the world. We know we have deep unresolved issues in terms of our founding as a country, which I started with, and we've just seen this week the handing down and the end of the first official truth telling process in Victoria, at least, about the realities of what colonisation has meant for First Nations people. And so that's one of the internal things that we still have a long way to go on in terms of really grappling with and acknowledging the reality of our history here. But our place in the region and our place in the world more broadly is another piece of that. There's always been this kind of discomfort, I think, in Australia as to this kind of white European outpost that is actually located in between Southeast Asia and the Pacific. We are part of the Asia Pacific geographically, but that's always been this. There's been a level of discomfort, and different governments have then taken different approaches as to how much we move towards that or away from that. But because the Asia Pacific region, unlike every other geographic region in the world, also does not have, certainly from a human rights perspective, any kind of regional mechanism. We don't have the African Charter on People's Rights. We don't have the European Convention on Human Rights. We don't have the Inter-American Court system and all of the mechanisms, which have all informed the international structures. But the Asia Pacific, has missed out on all of that and is incredibly diverse. It would be very difficult to do, but those other areas are pretty diverse as well. And so I think that's also contributed to this lack of architecture to help hold things together that Australia could potentially connect in with. We do have ASEAN, of course, and Australia engages there increasingly with the Pacific, but also not in uncomplicated ways. So just as you've referenced those bilateral agreements, we're also doing bilateral agreements to try to outsource asylum seekers that have no pathway to resolution and who we're trying to deport. I mean, the level of outrage, I would expect there should be a similar level of outrage of Australia trying to outsource to its neighbours people's lives, as we have when there was an understanding in the Australian public that we were sending a whole lot of our rubbish and recycling to China. I mean, there's outrage about that, but not people. And I think, so I think we have a very mixed record there, and but a huge amount that we can contribute, but we can only contribute on an equal footing if we actually also take seriously our domestic, what's happening in our own backyard, and understandably that accusations of hypocrisy are rightly levelled at Australia. When we come out and talk about human rights standards. But I think one of the blind spots, not only for Australia, but where your question started, is how we talk about our allies and how we use our voice. Now we are a middle power. We're never going to be operating at that higher level, but there's a really critical role that countries like Australia can play, and we often do join together with Canada and New Zealand, for example, in international fora. We have often come out much more strongly around human rights issues, in particular, in countries like Myanmar or, in relation to a number of places. But the silence is often deafening when it comes to our own allies, and I think that's partly reflective of Australia's security history as well. That initially we had attached ourselves and we went off and fought Britain's wars for it. That really changed after the two big world wars, and we moved so extensively to the dependence on the US for our security in the region, and that has meant that that has come at a cost to Australia. Whether you look back to the Vietnam War, or more recently with the Gulf Wars and Australia's kind of involvement there. And we are, I think, at a really critical point of Australia's maturation as a country to be able to then look more critically at, of course, we have security alliances and all of the considerations that go with that, but making sure that we are not hitching ourselves so tightly to a wagon taking us to places that we might not want to go. And so I think it is a critical moment as Australia finds its place, finds its voice, and can be confident in doubling down on what are our values that we actually want to protect. And I think, I think this recent election result was influenced by that there was a significant concern about not wanting to import the kind of level of politics of division and fear that people were seeing taking place in the US, and there was a rejection of that, which is a positive step.
Yeah, in fact, right before we started speaking today, I looked up some recent poll results regarding Australian views of the United States and the current leader of that country. And 77% of Australians said they had no confidence that the current president of the United States would do the right thing in foreign affairs matters. So that's a huge majority. And only 29% of Australians had a favorable view of the United States, which has declined dramatically in recent years. So when that's the case with regard to your number one military ally, some national discussion really needs to take place. And I think in a way it began decades ago with Mr. Eloquence himself, Prime Minister Paul Keating, who had these famous speeches on the floor of Parliament. Very colorful language, shall we say. But he was the first one to really put it out there that we're actually, an Asian country in effect, at least Asia Pacific. And we have to start realizing that. And so it's kind of transcending this horrible past of, where it's literally called the White Australia policy, and then becoming very much of a immigration country overall, which has fundamentally altered the demographic fabric of this society infinitely for the better. And the fact that Albanese, the prime minister of today, made his first foreign visit to Indonesia at the beginning of his second term is also quite symbolic, and that was not done by accident. So maybe there is this growing sense that we are much more a part of Asia, that countries that most Australians completely ignore, Indonesia, for instance, our closest neighbor, it's got 280 million people, 10 times what Australia's population is. Even if you viewed it exclusively from an economic perspective, think of the market, that it's much bigger than that. But so I think there are lots of positive steps, and that they are engaging more with the Pacific, that there is sort of a reluctance to look only again at the United States as going to come to somehow Australia's rescue. We have this ANZAC treaty, the ANZUS treaty rather, Australia, New Zealand, United States, where each party is meant to support the other in the event of a military attack. And I know for certain there's a lot of doubt whether the U.S. would consider that valid and binding if we really needed them. But I think a lot of Australians need to transcend this idea that the yellow horde is coming, and that if we somehow embrace Asia more, we're just going to get invaded. And it's important to remember that Australia did get heavily bombed in the Second World War by Japan. I mean, that's a reality, and they wiped out the city of Darwin in the north of the country. And so it's not a completely fabricated fear, but at the same time, the reality of geography cannot be changed, and it's going to serve Australia's interests much more. And in my humble opinion, I hope Australia takes the lead much more, and maybe this idea of getting a new UN Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders is a first step in that process. We get a National Human Rights Act adopted. We get judges who actually have to get training in how to apply international human rights laws, and the society will notice that society does not crumble because international human rights laws are used in court judgments. And then, the sky's the limit in that regard. So any final thoughts today? What's your prognosis for Australia's human rights future, Caitlin?
Well, I think it's really important to recognise how much we do have and do enjoy in Australia, but that should not blind us in any way to looking at where the gaps are. And just this week, the Human Rights Measurement Index, which is a big global methodology that measures human rights performance of different countries, just put out its new data, and it showed that Australia, like many other established democracies, has gone backwards in the last 5 years on certain core human rights protections, including safety and security from the state and really significant harm caused to certain groups of people, and that is falling disproportionately on particular groups, particularly First Nations communities, as well as racial minority communities in Australia, including but not limited to those who are recent arrivals. And really grappling with the reality of that doesn't detract at all from the importance of the overall benefits that Australia has, but we can all do a lot better when we're not just looking at things only through a glass half full, or just with blind spots, recognizing the blind spots, because those blind spots are also important if we are to have genuine relationships of reciprocity and respect within our region with our neighbours, because that ultimately is the best protection for us. We are an interconnected world, and much as this is a big island and sometimes that island mentality takes over, we know that that's not the nature of the world that we live in. And so it's an exciting time, and I really do hope that this is a chance to fill in a missing piece of the puzzle in the Australian legal framework, of actually having human rights protections built in, and so that we can continue actually contributing to the international space as well as doing that domestically.
Yeah, and so much of it is really just a mindset in the end. Like I lived a big chunk of my life in the Netherlands, for instance. There is a sense of national shame. I mean, it might be different now because politics has changed a lot since I lived there, but there's a sense of national shame if the European Court on Human Rights would say to Holland, you violated Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. People would be really ashamed about that, and there's conversely a sense of pride when they are told you complied fully with Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whatever it may be. And I think that sort of needs to also be infused within, the culture, because so much of it, as you said, this fair go principle, the tall poppy idea, really a deep sense of kind of, egalitarian society. It's changing, but it's still really there. Yes, class is still a real thing, but there is a degree of classlessness here, comparatively speaking, to the U.S. and the U.K. in particular, which I think is a really positive foundation of the society on which human rights can be built. So with that, thank you very much for watching, everybody. Thank you very much, Caitlin Reiger from the Australian Human Rights Law Center. This is Democracy Tomorrow. We'll be back with another episode. Please subscribe and like and tell your friends, and we'll be back soon. Thanks for watching. Bye now.